why is it natural for large multinational companies to pay for their employees to go get abortions? Well, they manage people as cells on a spreadsheet, and someone's going to be a much more predictable cell responding much more predictably to incentives if she doesn't have a baby than if she has a baby. They're going to respond more predictably to incentives if wokeness has helped strip them of any attachments to their culture or their family, and they're now they're now an individual who owns nothing.
Welcome to the Renaissance of Men podcast. My name is Will Spencer. My guest this week is Nate Fischer, and he's the CEO of New Founding Ventures, a venture firm for the American right, and he's the co-founder of American Reformer, a new organization and online journal to address from a Protestant perspective contemporary political and cultural issues that help confront related institutional threats. These are two organizations that I'm very excited about because they reflect the ethic and mindset of conquest of this land for Christ, but in a particular way, through the construction and recapture of institutions. With New Founding, that's what Nate is doing in technology ventures. And with American Reformer, he's bringing that same approach to other areas of American society. In his own words, he's a non-consensus thinker. Dr. Jordan Peterson might call him productively disagreeable. These are traits that I can relate to. And this is what it means to take dominion, to build a Christian nation, to not just talk post-mill, but live it. And it's also what it means to be a man. In our conversation, Nate and I discussed America's retreat to conservatism, why technology is inherently a political space, the myth of public neutrality, catechizing the algorithms, Nate's upbringing and background, how to confront Nietzsche, and finally, the flaws in the ideology of equality. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. I'm back on my interview grind with some big episodes coming up. So don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notifications. Plus, leave a comment down below letting us know what excites you most about conquering America for Christ. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the CEO of New Founding, the co-founder of American Reformer, and my kind of non-consensus thinker, Nate Fischer. Hey, Nate, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Will.
So I wanted to start out by thanking you because I have a background in big tech. I was part of the dot-com boom in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so I got a good look at the technology industry back then. Of course, I've traveled a long way since then. But one of the questions that I've been asking lately is, where is the Christian and conservative influence in technology, which is so essential to our world today? So when I discovered New Founding and New Founding Ventures, I was incredibly excited because I think you're filling a huge need there that we need to bring institutions to bear on, I guess, our cultural conversation.
I'm glad you see that, because I also think that's a key void, a key need in our society, and one that too often I think Christians are nervous about tech. They're averse to tech rather than recognizing that tech can be a powerful tool for the mission we're called to. And I mean, two things: a powerful tool and kind of a domain that we need to be in, because it is going to be shaping our world, whether you like it or not. And we absolutely need to be where the action is in that sense.
So let's start with what do you think the resistance, where do you think that comes from? Where do you think that suspicion of technology as such comes from?
So I would say it's twofold, and it's a self-reinforcing cycle. So first off, I think in some sense, the American right has moved from being something with a consciously positive vision to I would call it a retreat to conservatism. And this is sort of a post-war trend you see, where we retreat as has been put, we retreat from the foundational questions to, this is a point made by John Ascanis, there was a retreat from the foundational questions to one where we're simply conserving the good things of the past. And that lets us manage some disagreement, lets us avoid really confronting perhaps fundamental conflicts between our vision of where we want things to go and where the left does, or even where different groups within the coalition on the right want to go. And instead, you settle on here's some good things that we can acknowledge help society function well. They were a part of our tradition, they're part of our heritage, and so we're going to direct all of our energy at focusing on preserving those. Well, the point that John makes that's key is technology guarantees that's a losing strategy. As technology develops, it is always going to erode more and more of those traditions and those norms and those patterns and just ways of life. And that's just inherent in technological development. It results in change. It results in the change of how you interact. It results in the change in the economy. And so if your identity centers on preserving good things of the past, then technology is this sort of ever-present enemy that you constantly see contributing to their loss. What's key about that is that mission, if it's just again a retreat from the foundational questions, doesn't give you a firm positive vision about how you can use technology in a positive way to reshape things. It's simply stuck at chipping away at things that you value. So that's going to lead to an inherently pessimistic view of technology. It's going to lead to, I think it's going to lead to something where there's a little bit of a fatalism too, because you do see technology developing. You know it's not going to stop. You see a lot of this on the right where they effectively, the right, like the left, the conservatives also accept a sort of progressive narrative history. They don't like it. Their goal is to slow it down, but they accept that it's sort of inevitable. And so it is. If your entire goal is, if all of your effort is just focused on preserving the good things of the past, technology is the enemy, and you're going to lose. I think that leads to a pessimism. In many cases, it leads to a inaction where, as you see technology proceeding, you just know that there's not that much you can do to stop it. It certainly doesn't motivate people to jump up and get into the arena and leverage this technology to build something they want. And what we need, and then that becomes reinforcing because, again, the fewer Christians are involved in technology, the more the technology is going to be dominated by people who truly are leftist in their viewpoint of the world, or the more those people are going to influence even people who might have a more neutral view. The more the only vision of the future that's being put out there is going to be shaped by the left in a way that's going to lead to technology further taking on that sort of leftist shape and advancing a leftist vision. So, of course, that's going to lead to conservatives being even more skeptical of the technology and sort of reinforce their belief that technology is contributing to evil, maybe inherently problematic.
That last bit is what I would have expected. The argument would be that it's like, well, look, technology is being used for evil, therefore technology is evil, versus the what you described, the post-war consensus and the retreat to conservatism, which I think that's an excellent observation. So and that actually helps puts a bunch of pieces together in the picture for me as well. So as you've ventured in to this technology world with this vision and these sets of values, I'm guessing that you found people that agree either quietly or less quietly now, because that would be the surprise, right? Like if you're looking at the technology world and you're seeing it dominated by liberals and progressives all the way up, that you can actually look into that world and see that there are those few Christian conservative holdouts. So like, I'm actually not okay with this. And maybe there's more of that all the time. I mean, that must be starting to spring up pretty much everywhere.
So you have I would say there's two groups, right? You have a lot of people who are involved in technology. They're just, in many ways, I would say entrepreneurial technology embodies the American spirit. I mean, Americans have been drawn to that sort of thing. It fits our mindset. It also, I would argue, fits the Christian mindset. We're called to take dominion over the earth. We're called to a quest to change and to reshape the earth. And someone who really believes that, who really takes that seriously, if their talent is business, if their talent is technology, is engineering, they are going to be drawn to that space. So you have a lot of people who don't buy into leftist values, who go into technology and they want to achieve change, and they're not happy. They're not satisfied with the prevailing left-wing vision for what technology is supposed to accomplish. And just to give a more concrete example, I've talked about a sort of way that left-wing values shape technology very clearly. And I saw this as part of what made me realize technology was inherently a political space. Think of Facebook's mission, its older mission. I think it's changed it since then, but its mission was to make the world a more open and connected place. That's not just we're going to sell widgets like a company that's in the widget business. It's not even Microsoft's vision, which was a computer on every desk. That's certainly a computer on every desk is going to reshape the world in important ways. But really, that's just we want to sell more of our widget to more people. No, to make the world a more open and connected place is fundamentally a question around how we're going to organize society in what's a profoundly and inherently political way.
Yep.
And that it's not just that, it's to do so in a way that is, I would say, it's progressive in the sense that you believe that connecting people is going to make it more open, is going to make it more that open and connected is a positive thing. To do so at a global level reflects a very globalist mindset toward this. There's clearly lots of political assumptions baked into that. You see even more explicitly political ones in many cases where a lot of technology is fundamentally wrapped around liberation from something or other. And much of it was around embracing certain types of expression that are just inherently problematic. I mean, Tumblr, I think some theories are Tumblr really was the start of a lot of the trans ideology and the rise of that kind of thing. And they would see that as good. They would see that as a mission to help free people. And I look at that. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs who see this prevailing doctrine for how technology is going to change the world. And they're just not satisfied with it. They're looking for something else. They're not necessarily political thinkers themselves. They don't necessarily have a sort of firm vision for what they should be aiming for, but they know that the prevailing vision is not satisfying. It doesn't motivate them. It's not what they want to be working toward. And they're hungry. And that's, I think, part of what gets them excited about New Founding, where they see us developing a positive vision for how technology can change the world. And people are excited. They're excited to build the country they want. Our motto is build the America you want to live in. And there's a lot of people who don't like the America they're living in. And they jump at the chance to direct their strongest skills, their greatest efforts toward building something that they do want to live in.
There's a book called You Are Not a Gadget by a man named Jaron Lanier. It was written probably around, you've heard of the book.
I've heard of the book. I've not read it, but I'm familiar with it. I'm familiar with Jaron too.
Yeah, it's an excellent book that talks about the inherent biases that are built into technology on a fundamental level that are inextricable from the thing. Like Twitter is a good example. Twitter has 280 characters, and everyone is presented their same 280 characters in the same size font. So somebody who could be a global expert in a subject matter would be presented right alongside somebody who knows nothing about it. And visually, interface-wise, their opinions are given equal worth. And that wouldn't exist in any online space, but it's a programming design decision that's baked into the technology at a fundamental level. And the book talks about how that's throughout all technology platforms, the unasked questions that we're just assuming with these things that we interact with every day. What are the values inherent in them that are influencing us all the time?
Exactly. Nothing's neutral. Now, I think that as a technology develops, there's ways to apply it in ways that are going to tend toward one direction, tend toward another, but nothing's neutral. And I think this is actually another important factor. It shaped how it shaped why we are very comfortable with this intersection of politics and business. Far from seeing that as sort of two conflicting goals. A lot of people see these as conflicting goals. It's that neutrality, and this, I think, technology above all has made clear that the sort of 20th century myth of public neutrality is untenable. People are recognizing that. The left actually recognized that very clearly. You saw the left, I think, recognize that before the right did, and they were the first ones calling for things like AI ethics and algorithmic justice and all this stuff. And what they're really asking for, they recognize that when you have an algorithmic feed, and this is sort of the most obvious version, the version you gave is a little more sophisticated, but the most obvious version is you go type a search term into Google, you're going to get a number 1 result, you're going to get a number 2 result, you're going to get a number 10 result. There must be a value system that judges that 1 is better than 2, and there must be a reason it judges that 1 is better than 2. That's not neutral. That cannot be neutral. And in a world where more and more of your decisions are mediated by algorithms like this, you're seeing something where people recognize that in many ways it could be seen as aspects of the public square. It could be seen as aspects of sort of the digitization of societal norms, but it's not neutral. And really, societal norms have never been neutral. But we had this myth, particularly, I think, post-World War II, 20th century in America, that you could have this sort of neutral public square and this sort of engagement of different ideas. And especially a lot of Christians and conservatives, it's really a liberal idea. A lot of Christians and conservatives bought into it. And I think it was sort of in some ways, it was sort of an adoption of convenience by people who were largely the minority in terms of elite opinion. And so defending neutrality, defending this marketplace of ideas, at least gave them space to exist. The left abandoned that. Obviously, we saw that with the wokes in many domains. The left abandoned it. But I think they abandoned it rightly because they're savvy enough to recognize way ahead of many people on the right that in this digitally mediated world, there's no neutrality. It's not possible. Someone's going to determine the values that shape the Facebook algorithm, for instance. And if that Facebook algorithm contributes to the elevation of content that contributes to the election of Donald Trump, they don't like that. And they're going to put in their, they're going to make an effort to change that algorithm. Well, I think that we obviously have very strong value systems for what we believe is good. And as Christians, we should have a very clear sense of what a good Google algorithm would elevate. It would elevate the good and the true. We actually understand how to think about the good and the true. They don't even have to know how to think about that in many ways. In many ways, engineers, why did Facebook reward what it rewarded? It rewarded the kind of thing engineers know how to measure, which is engagement. Engagement in the absence of coming up with a conscious value system, they're going to reward engagement. They're going to reward sort of whatever the metric is. It's a very engineering friendly metric. The left is really pushing them to catechize those bots with their values, with their sort of public religion of wokeness. Well, we have an alternative that I think we very clearly recognize that a good search engine is going to return truth at the top, for instance. And I think we need to get into that domain. I think as Christians, we need to move out of the mindset that this is just a sort of neutral domain in which we can put out our arguments and recognize that the technology itself is going to be laden with values that we should be shaping.
Yeah, the early Google algorithm, the way that it ranked, it probably doesn't do this now, but the way that it ranked results was based on inbound references. So if you and I both have a web page, and my web page has 5 inbound references from other web pages and yours has 10, the Google algorithm would have assumed that yours was therefore more credible than mine. It's very engineering friendly, as you said. So that's actually a very interesting idea to say that we could rank search results based on truth via an objective standard, objective scriptural standard. I'm going to actually spend a few minutes thinking about that. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because that's a fascinating idea.
So I think it's a challenge, but I would think of that as a mission, as a goal. But going to the Google, the original Google one, yes, you're right that it changed. That was the original one, is backlinks. Yeah. Backlinks were the driver of the page rank. Now, I believe, and again, I'm not an expert in the details of this, but I believe that it's not just any backlink, because otherwise you could just create all sorts of websites, but it's backlinks that are in turn weighted according to the credibility of the website. So if the New York Times gives a backlink to your site, that's more valuable than some random blog. And I would say what Google was elevating is, I wouldn't even say it's elevating credibility. I would say what it's trying to elevate is significance or relevance. So when you're typing something, Google wasn't attempting to make a judgment that more backlinks mean this thing is more credible. I mean, you could have a backlink from the New York Times to something that it's accusing of being a Nazi site, and obviously they don't mean that in a positive sense at all. But it means that it's a sort of significant enough site to have merited that backlink from the Times.
Right.
I would say that certainly you can elevate significance, but even when they come up with the weighting of some of the sites themselves, there's a value system. Which are the ones that matter? Is it the New York Times versus some other site that might get similar traffic but be seen as less credible by many people? I would say that decision itself is one of the first ones you could think about, is who are the sort of anchors? What are the sites what are the authorities who are seen as the anchors of credibility in any sort of system. Now, it takes more to figure out whether they're, I think, endorsing it positively or negatively, and the backlink system was not, I think, designed to figure that out. But that would be a start. Is we're going to have a different ranking. We're going to have a different sort of top level ranking for the credibility of the sites that are doing that are sort of anchoring the whole system. In terms of more broadly, I think catechizing the algorithms, profoundly challenging problem. I think there's a lot of different ways to think about that. Ultimately, this again goes to some of the questions that I know Lanier has addressed. I don't know I don't know his specific thinking on that, but do we put technology in charge of humans, or do we put humans in charge of technology?
Right.
And I think increasingly with AI, you have situations where there's a fear that the technology will replace people, will supplant people. I would say in many cases, Silicon Valley has an ideology that celebrates that. They're often trying to replace people with technology. And many of them have a very pessimistic view of the human person. They're materialists. They certainly don't understand the concept of image of God, and are distinct and sort of special traits as people created in the image of God. So they have with a materialistic view of people. And I would say they have not just a materialistic view of people, but a fairly dim view of people. And the example I'll give is how they think about entrepreneurship. I mean, many think of entrepreneurship almost in very sort of evolutionary terms. It's sort of a bunch of random mutations. Lean startup, I think, sort of reflects. A lot of lean startup approaches reflect this, where you have sort of random, it's almost like the market is a bunch of random experiments, and then the ones that sort of succeed. They survive in the evolutionary landscape, and the other ones fail. And that's how you achieve progress. And it's a very sort of indefinite view of progress. I would contrast that one, and I think George Gilder has done a very good job of talking about some of these concepts. Knowledge and Power was a book that really influenced me, where you're really thinking about the entrepreneur as a creator who, just like God created the universe out of nothing. When you create something, you are conceiving of something and, in a sense, willing it into reality. And that's far more than just sort of taking a random stab, making a sort of random investment, slightly better than average odds or whatever, if you're sort of the max that they'll assign to sort of human judgment, and then sort of hoping that it survives. Like that's a function. That's a function that AI is not doing. It's a function that is not even it's not even in the same category as what AI does, which is essentially a sort of statistical prediction. And I think if you appreciate that aspect of humanity, of human nature, you're going to have a more positive view of what the person does. And you're going to think about even the architecture of products in ways that are more likely to be thinking about how you can sort of leverage and empower people, essentially give them more capacity, give them more power to create and to rule over creation, rather than try to come up with technology that, in a sense, manages the people. And I'll use Uber as an ultimate example of that, where the person is kind of the lowest layer and they're just sort of filling in the gaps that the technology can't do until you could have driverless cars. But the person is not much of an agent in that system. And that's the model that a lot of enterprise software, I think, falls into, where it tries to sort of pull as much as possible away from the person and let them narrow their function.
Yeah, narrow their function down to predictability and ultimately elimination.
Yep.
This is giving. I spent 20 years living in the Bay Area, 15 years, and so I kind of grew up in the mindsets that permeated. I had friends who were at some of the highest levels of some of the tech companies, and they were just. I got to know the things they thought about. In fact, that was how I heard about Yuval Noah Harari way back in the day, as all the tech people got really enthusiastic about his book. So what you're proposing is very intriguing to me, because it's a very different way of thinking about problems that I had marinated for a long time, that I just kind of put back on the shelf. And now you're giving me opportunity to sort of take it out and begin rethinking, well, what is actually approach to Christian technology? What is a Christian dominion approach to technology? I can see why this is so this is so powerful for so many people because we're just not used to thinking this way. Why it would be actually confrontational, like very confronting to some people, why they would have resistance to it, because it's a very new way of thinking about some very significant topics.
It's certainly it's a fascinating space, and I think it brings together some very interesting strands of thought you see. I mean, I think you have Christians who are rediscovering the concept of Christendom, who are rediscovering the concept of what it really means as Christians to fulfill our calling in the world. And I would say those are the most interesting strands of Christian thought at the moment. And it also brings together, I think, a lot of the sort of consciously political thinkers in technology. And you see a lot of this, I think, in the crypto world, where in the crypto world, Bitcoin certainly, people knew from the very beginning these are political technologies. Their technologies often have an explicit purpose of challenging existing systems or institutions that are recognized as political power centers, used in ways that are found that are believed to be undesirable. But you see this in, I think, a lot of other people who are not necessarily in that space directly, but are adjacent to it or are thinking about similar questions. And in many cases, I think those are the people who recognize that when you build something like the Facebook algorithm, it's not neutral. If you have someone who just approaches that from an engineering mindset, they'll just sort of default to putting in an engineering-friendly metric or target without even necessarily realizing that this is going to have profound impacts on society. But I think you have this sort of growing movement of people who are very cognizant of that and realize that in many ways that's a question of statecraft that's going to shape the contours of the digital age in important ways. And I think bringing together those two strands is exciting. They're not I think deeply engaged with each other, but they're often dealing with very similar questions, very similar critiques of the status quo and the pretense of neutrality that our society held as an ideal. And I think we're in a position where we can bring those together and ideally, I think, shape the thought that in turn is reflected in the technology built by many of the people in that world.
Yeah. I'm sitting here in the middle of getting my paradigm completely shifted. So thank you for that. So these questions that you're asking now, is this, what was the path that led you to work on this? Is this a dawning realization? Was this, you started weaving these threads together on your own? Is this an area that you've always been interested in? Like, how did you arrive to tackling these subjects of these questions, these subjects and these threads?
That's a good question. And I think, to be completely frank, I'm not sure what exactly led me here.
Yeah.
I'll give some background on sort of my career, and I think that'll help frame it. So I grew up homeschooled, and I was homeschooled I was homeschooled through 12th grade too, through all of high school. I'm 38 years old, so it was early days of homeschooling. We're in New York. Certainly, it was a very nonconformist approach, and the way we did it was a relatively sort of free form of homeschooling, not quite Montessori, but directionally closer to that than some of the more prescribed ways. So I think I grew up in a house. It was a very Christian. It was Christian, but it was also very, I think, open in terms of how we thought about things, combined with conservative Christianity. So I was always sort of very anchored to Christianity as this important anchor for truth, but interested in outside of the box ideas, outside of the box perspectives, things that interested in politics, interested in things that would have impact on the world. While in college, I studied political science. While in college, I did a program in DC and just became very quickly convinced. And I'd sort of been interested in business. I'd been interested in technology. I'd been programming a computer since I was 8 years old, started programming a PC Junior and BASIC. So again, some familiarity with technology, some interest in business, some interest in politics. And but it was in college that I did a summer in DC and realized that very, very clearly that politics at the time was a place where if you're a non-consensus thinker, you're going to be shunted to the side. There's really no room. It's a place that rewards, I think, a sort of Mitt Romney style careerist mindset, and it really does not reward anything outside the box. So I knew that I was interested in non-consensus ideas. I guess I've always been a little disagreeable too. That's probably it could just be pretty basic personality trait as a major explainer. But maybe. I love to provoke. And when I was around conservative homeschoolers, I'd provoke the conservatives. But as a general rule, I was still anchored to a Christian viewpoint. I immediately switched in my mind to business. In my mind, I said, look, investing, if you have a non-consensus but correct position in investing, you prove right, you make a lot of money. Way more interesting to me. And that was just immediately what I knew I wanted to do. Went to law school. I saw that as a path to get there. And coming out of law school with a focus on some extent bankruptcy and distress was the goal. Went to buy distressed real estate in Florida and Texas in 2011, or coming out of the financial crisis. It was deeply distressed. There was actually a little bit of a political aspect to this view. The view was that people are going to keep moving from blue to red states. There's this sort of continued demographic migration that's been a tailwind for Florida and Texas for decades, and that's going to continue. And if you have something that's deeply distressed today, but you know this tailwind's here, you almost can't lose. Anyway, we bought about 7,000 apartments, really wild, sort of aggressive entrepreneurial learning experience, partnering with a classmate, Peter Rex, who's one of the extraordinary entrepreneurs of our generation, naturally. Learned a lot, and I think had that sort of affirmation of the rewards of outside the box views and the power of leverage, being in a space where you can really leverage. Fast forward a number of years, and I think we saw during the Trump era that my thesis about politics was no longer true. We're no longer in an era where the Mitt Romney types are climbing. We're now in an era where someone who is using media actually as a powerful source of leverage knows that game. As a non-consensus thinker, is pushing those people out of the party, pushing those people to the side, and is really driving a paradigm shift rooted in political ideas. And secondly, what I saw exactly the sort of thing I referenced at Facebook. I saw all of these Silicon Valley companies are actually very political in the way they're talking about the world, in a way that's meaningfully different from the way I think they were talking about it 10, 15 years before, where it was a much more straightforward, like, we're excited about this technology. It was much more classic engineering. They realize it's political. I mean, you look at WeWork and their mission. They very clearly talked about it like they're on this mission to change the world and reshape how we live. Facebook, Twitter, all of these. And so you had this sort of these two threads coming together, which is that politics is actually where the action is. It's where the action is, and it's where there's an opportunity for paradigm shift. And you see this sort of growing politicization of tech, or recognition of the political nature of disruptive technology. And that just came together in a way that I think drew me. It made me recognize this is now where the opportunity for that kind of leverage is going to be, the kind that was there in let's say investing in 2011. But it was really, you combine that with really 2019, 2020. I think that the sort of increasing, negative suppression of the left, suppression by the left that you saw during the Trump era, and then especially during COVID, where this sort of dark pale comes over the society. I felt called. I felt like I had no choice but to jump in and actually actively try to change things. I'm not just going to invest. I'm not just going to trade and make bets on what seemed like the decline of the country. I need to jump in. I need to try to do what I can to change the direction of this. And venture and technology and starting a business seemed like the clear path to actually hopefully influence and in a few cases directly shape some of the levers that are levering technology toward a particular technology, and in many ways media toward a particular vision.
So it sounds
like a very long-winded way of getting there, but it's I think it was a lot of different threads that came together to influence that.
Yeah, no, not long-winded at all. In fact, I know many men, myself included, if you were to ask, like, how did you arrive doing the thing that you are doing today? The answer would be very similar. It's sort of a dawning realization of putting a bunch of pieces together of expertise and interests, coupled with time and experience, sort of arriving at this moment in 2020 where it's like something is happening. I would like to play a role. I have a role to play. I have all these raw materials here in front of me. What am I going to put them together to do in response to this moment? And that seems to be a very consistent theme with many of the men that I've gotten to interview, many of the men that I've gotten to meet, that something catalyzed in America and world history, perhaps, bringing men and women forward to say, I have something to say in response to this, and I'm going to bring all my life history, all my professional history, all of my interests, and then you couple faith with that to begin to create something very powerful that's starting to move in very concrete ways that I think that you're expressing in New Founding.
It's certainly something that we've heard from many people, and part of the nature of venture is I'll go a little bit into the model, but our model is we're in a world where it's no longer possible to talk about many of the values that matter the most to people. Or it's not it's not that it's no longer possible, but it's for many people, especially people who are high levels in professional careers, it's not something that they can broadcast through normal professional channels in ways that allow them to connect with others who share their values. So the thesis there was there's going to be a very high return. If I can do that, if I can go to and do that through media, through things like appearing on podcasts like this, this is an example to reach a lot of people who may not be able to broadcast their views directly, but they can reach out to us, and that's a form of leverage. And then we have the ability to essentially make matches that could never happen otherwise, whether that's between investors. So a lot of it's capital, right? We're raising a fund right now. There's a lot of people who know that they recognize the opportunity here. They also know that they want to invest in ways that actually are building the country they want to live in, that align with their values. Venture is about making that match, sometimes through a fund, sometimes through a syndicate. But we could match the capital. We could match two founders together. We could match someone who's ready to join a growing company. You could match people in a professional space. But there's a lot of matches to be had here where the existing professional networks have become so hostile to our values, to our views, that they're totally unsatisfactory for brokering transactions where those values are sort of the most salient point in the interaction. And at the very same time, because those values have become, in many ways, because the sort of predominant leftist political values have become so pervasive, you've had a growing number of people where working with people who share their values becomes something that deeply, deeply matters to them. And so just as more and more people are seeking those sorts of matches are not available through conventional channels. And the beauty of a model like ours is we get to hear from a lot of those people. I love having those conversations. I have those conversations all the time. People reach out to us, whether it's a Twitter DM, a LinkedIn in-mail, whatever the case may be. There's lots of ways that people reach. We have forms on our website, and just talk to people and put things in motion, connect people to other people, and ideally help accelerate the growth of this ecosystem.
So as you've been doing this, I imagine that you've found support from surprising places and friction from surprising places. This seems a lot like a frontier to me, and where those sorts of things tend to happen. So to the extent that you can, where have you been surprised to find support that you didn't expect it? And where have you been surprised to find friction or pushback that you didn't expect it?
So in terms of support, I would say, and it's not necessarily I went into this to some extent without a extremely well-developed hypothesis for sort of the lay of the land, because I knew that things were in, I was sort of new to this political scene a little bit. I'd been in business. I would say I could say I was sort of red-pilled in my approach to business. And that went back to, I think to some extent it went back to my sort of natural disagreeableness and aversion to the sort of conventional MBA way of thinking. My business partner, very, very independent thinker, very much someone who recognized, I think, errors of conventional, let's call it Harvard MBA analysis. and so I was sort of already independent in how I thought about business, but I didn't really know the lay of the land in the political space or the evangelical space particularly well. There, I sort of just didn't devote a lot of attention to it. So I didn't have particularly strong expectations. But what was interesting to me, I think there were a few things. One, this has drawn a lot of people who are not conventionally, they wouldn't have been seen as sort of on the conservative right 15 years ago, 10 years ago. It's a real realignment. I mean, there's a number of people who have reached out, top tier professionals in their space, a background that would have been seen as sort of a very normie background. But something clicked. Something clicked for them, and they want something. And they're much more fired up and motivated than, in many cases, a lot of people who would be sort of check all the boxes for being conservative by the standards of a decade ago. So a lot of evangelicals are by the standards of what has been, I think, what has been seen as conservative. They check all the boxes. They've been very conservative, but they're not motivated in the same way. In many ways, they don't have a vision for Christendom, right? They actually have a vision for faith that is very conventionally orthodox versus probably the debates that Machen dealt with, or the debates of sort of the liberalism of the 60s or the 70s. But it also is very, it really sort of narrows the faith. I think it defends against those partially by narrowing the mission of the church in a way that has led to a passivity that is very disappointing. And that's a big part of what we're trying to change with American Reformer, where our mission is really reinvigorating a robust Protestant vision for society and culture. Because I think unless we can activate evangelicals, unless we can activate all of those who really believe and take this seriously, unless churches can be led by people who are firing people up for this, we're going to be at a disadvantage. That's the group of people who really believe something significant. And I think it's disappointing the extent to which many ostensibly conservative Christians are happy to sort of find a way to go about their life, go about their mission in a way that avoids conflict with the world. And meanwhile, going back, you have a lot of people who generally they're younger people. I call it Gen X and younger, who are they see where things are going, and they do not want to let that happen. They want to figure out how they can somehow jump into the fight.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about American Reform, because this is getting into the subject of questions that I tend to grapple with, especially with a robust Protestant vision, like you said. Like literally, like minutes before we got on this interview, I got a text message from a friend, apropos of nothing, saying like, "Hey, I've been talking with a friend, and we feel like there's a giant Catholic versus Protestant Twitter thing that's about to happen." And I 100% agree. You can see this. You can see it beginning to surface, like a recapitulation of the Reformation through Twitter. And so, a robust Protestant vision versus secularism, but a robust evangelical Protestant vision, especially. So, let's talk about the mission of American Reform, because I think for my audience, this is another area of great interest.
So, it is thoroughly Protestant. It's I think it was built in response. Part of what, so there were a couple of things that motivated it. One is Aaron Renn. I've known Aaron Renn since probably 2019, as he was relatively early in the days of his newsletter. And it was really inspired by, an aspect of it was inspired by one of his newsletters, which was Christians should be on the advance, not the retreat. And it was a little bit of a wake-up call for me. I mean, I'd always had this sort of, a little bit of this sort of purist mindset that I think is very popular in conservative evangelicals, which is, look, we're going to be the most conservative. The best way to be a good conservative is you be sort of thoroughly conservative, and your institution goes liberal, and what do? You break off and you start a new one that's going to be truly conservative. And I think that's been, it's certainly been a habit among conservative evangelicals. You think of, I referenced Machen, right? He left the PCUSA and started a new church. But it's a lot older than that. I mean, it kind of goes to America itself, where America was founded by people who broke off and left so they could start their new thing. So it's really deeply in our blood. But it's certainly an instinct that can be self-defeating, because when you leave an institution, you leave tremendous institutional capital, financial capital, large numbers of people in many cases who are really, they would be up for grabs. They're not firmly committed one way or the other. I mean, if you leave a church because it's gone too liberal, there might be 30% of the congregation that's just going to default to staying. They could go either direction, and you're kind of leaving them to the wolves at that point. So it's not a decision that should be taken lightly. Again, absolutely don't believe that it's wrong to leave, but it needs to be a very strategic question rather than one that becomes just a simple conservative default. And Aaron, I think, made that point in a way that was really convicting. The second aspect is we're a Protestant country. We're a country where our heritage is Protestant, and yet the intellectual right is deeply disproportionately Catholic. And that's, first off, as a Protestant, I have to ask why. Why are we not represented in that thought? Why are we not represented in those circles? That's a problem, because we have a tradition that should have a lot to say about these questions. And I think it speaks to a deficit in evangelical culture, in many ways going to the one I pointed to earlier, which is this increasingly sort of privatized faith and aversion to the big public questions, which is actually, in many ways, it was a reaction to the social justice gospel, the social gospel that was always associated with liberalism. So you had a lot of people, I think you had a lot of true, very sincere conservatives who recognized that it was very easy for the gospel to get corrupted with a social mission, but sort of struck a lot of the sort of social and political thought, rather than realizing that might not be that might not be the central point of Christianity, but it's certainly a very important point. And secondly, just because the liberal version of it is wrong does not mean that the conservative version of it is not, or that the orthodox version of it is not valuable. So you have this situation where the Catholics are just totally dominating the intellectual thought, and we have this great tradition which most evangelicals are unaware of, and that's undesirable. I mean, we can remedy that. We can give them access to a tradition that's going to shape them to have a more robust vision. That's going to influence them to prepare them for confronting the cultural challenges of our day. The negative world, as Aaron Wrenn talked about, a world that's hostile to Christianity, where we need to really rethink and challenge. I mean, I'd say the negative world is no longer the neutral world. The myth of neutrality is gone, as the left has embraced something post sort of liberal neutrality. But secondly, if you just think of it purely from a practical political perspective, let's say you weren't a Protestant, let's say you're a Catholic, I would still argue that this is important, because in many cases the Protestant tradition and the Catholic tradition actually come to very, very similar things. That's why I'm not convinced that there will be a huge conflict with Catholics. I think in many ways there's certainly debates and there's certainly disagreements, but in many ways on a lot of the contemporary problems, Catholics and Protestants actually have traditions that come to very, very similar views. In many cases, rooted in whether it's rooted in natural law. A robust version of natural laws can come to a very similar place to how you come from studying the Bible and taking the Bible seriously on a lot of these matters of public morality and public ethics. In both cases, in a country that has a Protestant heritage and tradition and culture, even to the extent these people might not actually see themselves that way anymore, a message framed in Protestant terms is going to be more likely to resonate in the country. It's going to be more likely to succeed politically. And I think you can see this in a lot of different language. The Catholics have a particular language to talk about it. I'll agree with their conclusion, but I would probably talk about it somewhat differently. And you quote different people to support it. You use slightly different emphasis. And I think the Protestant one is more likely to resonate. I mean, it's not a coincidence that I think, that even in this era where a lot of the sort of leading thought is Catholic, Donald Trump is very culturally Protestant, and the way he frames things and messages things is very culturally Protestant. And I think the same is true, actually, in many ways of many of the sort of non-intellectual but broad Catholic doctrine. Even many Catholics are going to respond to something that's framed in culturally Protestant terms because they've really absorb that culture more than the other way around. So purely from a sort of realpolitik perspective, we need to recover. We need to recover the ability to discuss this in ways that are going to reflect the tradition that shaped our country. And that again was a key part of the American Reformer mission: is can we restore this? Can we, in a sense, be something of a Protestant First Things? And First Things is certainly somewhat ecumenical. They publish a range of people, but predominantly Catholic. And I think of them as one of the leading hubs of really very, very strong thought at the forefront of questions of where the country needs to go and the political challenges we face.
What sort of topics do you tackle on American Reformer in this spirit?
It's a wide range. It's and it's something that's in many ways, I think, to the extent that there's a public question that's getting a lot of debate, that Protestants have something to say. I would like American Reformer to be the forum where it is said, because or certainly one of the leading forums where it is said. I think I'd like to see it as this proliferates. I'd like to see it in more and more places and help elevate people. But that's I think the top way of thinking about it is what are questions that really matter politically, whether they're intra-right debates, like you see a lot of the debates between the sort of Nietzschean right and, let's say, the Christian right. And I think there's some really great debates and really important questions to have, and we've published a number of pieces on that, to questions of how should Christians respond to pervasive leftist sexual messages, for instance, which is just something that we're inundated with in society. And again, there's a great example. That's a great area where I think Catholics have a really well-developed theology of sexuality, and something that is often, I think, led people to convert to Catholicism, actually. In many cases, people recognize that is one of the deep problems of our society. Evangelicals do, and they're just not satisfied with the evangelical response to it. And they're right not to be satisfied. It's a pretty pathetic response in many cases. At best, sort of a very narrow biblicism. And they see Catholics having a much richer view of a positive vision, true positive alternative for sexuality. Well, the Catholics weren't the only ones who had that vision. All of the Reformers held a very similar vision. There's an enormous number of thinkers in the Reformed tradition who have deep thoughts on these matters. They're just not as well known, and they're not the ones being cited to respond. I want to remedy that. I want American Reformer to be a place that can be a center of that type of commentary, really in tune with what the problem is today. Again, it's not just doing it for the sake of sort of intellectual interest in this theology, but actually preparing Christians to confront it today. And then there's sort of a range of other things. So then I'll get into some of the other projects. So we have a project, the Center for Academic Faithfulness and Flourishing, just launched this summer. Jesse Ryan, leading scholar of higher education, deeply Orthodox Christian. The focus is, how do we prepare Christian colleges to deal with the sort of higher ed apocalypse that we're facing? The answer is, be more Christian. Why would you choose to send your kid to a private Christian college over, let's say, Texas A&M? The answer is generally going to be because there's a true, clear difference with the Christian college. It's embraced. It's proud of its Christian identity. It's embracing it. It shapes all aspects of it. For too many Christian colleges, they seek secular acceptability. They seek sort of respect in a world of academia. Again, in many cases, grounded in this idea that you can have a level of neutrality, that the sort of academic world, sure, you might have to work a little harder, but the academic world will recognize good academic work by their standards. But that leads them increasingly to sort of downplay their Christian distinctives, things that would be embarrassing in the sort of broader higher ed world. And that leads the school to essentially a suicide mission for the school, because the school is destroying the one thing that's going to make it distinct in a ruthlessly competitive market. Point Peter Thiel's made is, if you're competing with a bunch of other people, you're going to lose, you're going to die. And especially that's true in a contracting market. So our mission is, how do we provide guidance to those? How do we provide guidance to parents? And then finally, there's scholarship that's being done There's reform work, working on actually proactively working with people who are trying to fight for these Christian institutions and shape them in positive ways. And that's a central part of directly addressing that founding need, which is we need to be on the advance. What does it even mean? What is a playbook for people on the right? I think that's a missing thing. The right does not have, conservative Christians do not have a playbook for taking institutions. We have not tried to do that for a long time. The left has a lot of very clear playbooks to do that. They know exactly what they want to do. But you can't just imitate the tactics of the left. Those tactics are suited to leftist ends, and a sort of pure sort of right-wing mirror of them is not going to achieve right-wing results. It's going to at best be somewhat confusing. So part of our mission is actually developing out a playbook for what it looks like to take back institutions. I think it's a crucially important capability on the right, and it's naturally one that we're going to see pioneered at things like evangelical institutions, where the terrain remains often structurally friendly to us in important ways that give us a chance of success.
This is really interesting because some of the dialogues that I've navigated through have also engaged with the Nietzschean right, and I appreciate that element is now getting surfaced to a higher degree, because I think they have a lot of things to say that are appealing to a lot of men, but the worldview and ethics are completely broken at the core of it. And yet at the same time, you have men, Christian men especially, needing to begin coming into institutions, taking them back, building new institutions, but you have a retreatist kind of mindset as well. And so sort of caught between a lot of these ideas is a question, has been a question for me, is where is the Christian Protestant evangelical reform spirit to really take dominion, instead of like, we'll just kind of hang back and let things evolve, retreat to mere conservatism, or become Nietzschean vitalist, or, retreat to the farms. Like the homestead vision is a big part of it, what appeals to a lot of guys. And I try to encourage them, like, no, you have to stay where you are, and you have to fight to reclaim ground as much as you can. Now, obviously, if you're in a blue state, you're probably going to want to leave there for many other reasons. But if there's a battleground in front of you, you can fight from a Christian reformed perspective. And so I've been looking to find people who are advancing that idea. So this is very hopeful to me, because that's what I advance. That's what I promote for men to do, is, you as a Christian man have to fight for your institution as much as you can, whether that could be your workplace, that can be your church, that can be for your community, because building other ones, we're hundreds of years behind on that.
Absolutely. And I think that the Nietzschean question is a huge one. And I would say I wouldn't even draw a contrast between Christianity and vitalism. I actually think, vitalism, yes. But I would say part of the response is, and actually one program I didn't mention yet was, we have a Cotton Mather Fellows program at American Reformer. This summer we had 8 fellows, rising people either in the evangelical world, some in academia, some pastors, and one of the central topics of study was confronting Nietzsche. And I think the challenge is Nietzsche's critique was accurate in many important ways. Mm-hmm. It was certainly an accurate critique of many aspects of the Christianity of his day. Now, many aspects of the Christianity of his day was a liberalizing German Christianity, which has caused profound damage across the church. So I'm not going to. It's not like he was critiquing Christianity at its best, or pure Orthodox Christianity. And I think you actually look back and you look at what a truer Christianity is, a better vision of Christianity, and it's actually one that I think addresses many of the most resonant critiques by Nietzsche. It's certainly very different. It has a very different solution. In many ways, I would say it has something that's fundamentally more appealing than Nietzsche's solution, which ultimately is, it may be a resonant critique, but I don't think it's a very compelling alternative. But I think that's an important thing. And I think a key thing is Christianity offers a path to a truer vitality than anything that Nietzsche can offer. You think of Genesis 1, you think of the creation mandate. I mean, as I said, God created entrepreneurship. We understand what entrepreneurial creativity is in a way that a materialist does not. That's a true form of vitality, is creating something out of nothing. Just like you think of the cultural mandate, the dominion mandate. And we're given a very clear mandate to take dominion over the earth in a way that is a true form of vitality. So I think that for people who recognize the sort of deadness and soullessness of society that I think of a sort of modern bureaucratic society that Nietzsche obviously recognized, the answer is a revitalized Christianity.
Mm-hmm. And how do we go about doing that? I of course have my own ideas, and I see that happening around me, and I see a lot of men that have been on their own path of growth and development getting saved. It's a wonderful thing. I come from the New Age world, and there are a lot of people that have invested a lot of effort and energy into their own personal development who are now getting saved and bringing a refound vitality into the church and are really about that life, as we say. And so that's very cool to see. And the question that I've been grappling with is, and I don't think there's probably, as far as American society is concerned, it's one of the most important, if not the most important question, is how do we reinvigorate the evangelical Christian men? Like, what do we do about that? How do we kickstart the heart, meaning the seed of courage within men? And there's a lot to that, but I'm curious your thoughts.
It's a huge challenge, and I think things like what you're doing are an important part of that. I mean, just
thank you.
Getting messages out that reach them that are designed for men, because a huge part of the problem, again, an area that Aaron Renn has identified very well, and I think Aaron Renn's another in this space who's done great work in this area, and a lot of what he's recognized is critiquing the church for really failing men in many, many ways. The church is very feminized often. It serves women as its central customers. It often is very negative toward men. It's not uplifting. It is, many churches are not offering a positive vision of masculinity. The sort of most positive they can come up with boils down to be more like women in many cases. Mm-hmm. So it's a major void, and that's where it's crucial that they have voices and content that are providing an alternative there. So that I think is incredibly valuable. I think men want, but ultimately, I mean, what are men drawn to? It's not just about consuming content. They're drawn to that idea of claiming territory. They're drawn to the idea of creating things, building families, building businesses, taking back institutions, building a household, right? Having a house, having a physical piece of property, all of that. And so I think there's a reason that I'm in the commercial space. And I think that commerce in America in particular fulfills, especially entrepreneurial commerce, fulfills many of those important drives that men want to get together. I mean, it's can we bring people together to actually build things? Can we match them in jobs where their day-to-day job feels like they're building something? And I think that energizes people in a way that is crucial for men to feel like they're on a mission there. So that's a huge part of it. Again, the churches do need to be recovered. I think the churches in many ways should be viewed as territory to be reclaimed. In many cases, I mean, many of them. I think the pastor can be. I mean, in many cases, I think we just need to get out of mindsets that have been debilitating, and the pastor's great, very godly person, and just needs to, I think, figure out a model that answers the challenges of our day. And that's not going to be obvious, but we're working that out. So that's a great one. In other cases, you think of the church as a territory that needs to be reclaimed. It needs new leaders. The leaders are the problem. And I think we should have that mindset toward every institution in the world, but certainly every institution that claims the name of God should be recognized as something that we should hold to that standard. And again, I think men get energized by that. Just getting together with other men, huge part of it. So much of the idea of male spaces, fraternal spaces, have been destroyed in our society. They've been intentionally destroyed in many cases. Mm-hmm. Some of it's been, I think, a natural consequence of technology and other factors, but much of it has been an intentional destruction of those spaces, even outlawing of those spaces by people who recognize that they are dangerous to the status quo. Men getting together as men in a purposeful conversation are a threat to the liberal order in important ways. Just to get to illustrate it very clearly, you had pre-prohibition, you had a lot of, and I don't know if this is the historical reason, but pubs were a place where a lot of men would get together in ways that were conducive to political action. You have prohibition rolled out alongside a progressive reform era that tries to destroy they really tried to sort of replace politics with impersonal bureaucratic science that stripped away those, it sort of systematically through prohibition destroyed the sorts of spaces where that energy, that action, that concerted action develops. What do you have now in place of those? You have sports bars. Sports bars, high ambient volume, not conducive to sitting around having those conversations, much more conducive to a much more passive type of gathering. So even when men do get together, it's going to be much more passive than political in that sense. And I think that's a great example of, I think men ultimately are going to be animated by the ability to work with other men to achieve some degree of change, of shaping the earth.
That's a really interesting idea. Yeah, the vision of the salon, where the political discussions were explicitly held. Like the purpose of this space that we're gathering in is to have this conversation. It's not secondary to something else we're doing, like a sports bar or a cigar bar. It's like, no, we men who gather in the space, we gather explicitly to debate and hammer out ideas. That's a pretty exciting vision to bring something back. If some entrepreneurial man would like to invest in a chain of those.
I think it's the only thing that's going to drive the kind of change is men getting together, and men getting together in context conducive to that.
Agree. So we've talked about all the different institutions to reclaim, and the elephant in the room of institution to reclaim is American politics, Christian nationalism, and this is a subject of great interest for me. I'm quite passionate about it. I've noticed that you have been as well, and there's been a lot of discussion happening on Twitter or X about this, and so maybe we can transition to talking a little bit about that subject, because I think there's a lot of energy being funneled into the Christian nationalism debate, really from both sides, like for it, which I think ultimately has the better argument, and then against, and that's surfacing on social media. But let's dive into Christian nationalism a little bit and talk about the one big institution to be reclaimed, or claimed for the first time, I suppose, depending on how you look at it.
So high level, I think this is an exciting discussion because it's a conscious attempt to develop a true positive alternative to what the left is offering.
Yep.
And going back to my early point, that's what's been missing from the right for so long. The right's avoided these foundational questions, and it's avoided the foundational questions. It's really tried to sort of retreat to what can we all agree on preserving. And Christian nationalism is a return to both, I think, foundational questions. It leads to a lot of debates of foundational questions, and then it's also an attempt to build on those to construct a coherent alternative. And those processes need to go together. I don't think you can necessarily debate everything in the abstract without thinking about what are the implications of this in this situation. Yeah. So that is inspiring to see something like that. I think that people are right to recognize its danger. People on the left are right to recognize its danger, because what the left has to offer is not that appealing. And its greatest strength in many ways has been this assumption of sort of a progressive arc of history, this assumption that it's the default. But it's not something, by and large, if people really understand where the left wants to push things, a lot of them don't want to go that way. And presented with a coherent alternative, a true alternative, that may motivate a lot of people deeply around it. So they're right to be threatened by that. At the same time, I think there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions that need to be. These aren't the kind of things you can answer overnight. And I think there's both debate about where we should aim, and there's also, I think, very important debates, prudential debates. I mean, part of, I think, the appealing versions of Christian nationalism is they actually have a lot more room for prudence. they have a lot more room for prudence than, let's say, some other Christian doctrines. So I think you look at Christian Reconstruction, for instance, and some of the popular sort of alternatives presented in previous decades were very prescriptive in ways that didn't leave a lot of room for prudence. Whereas you read someone like Stephen Wolfe, and Stephen Wolfe is very strong on the sort of prudential judgment of the magistrate toward the good of the citizens. And given that appreciation for prudence, we also need to prudentially consider where we are today as a country, what our population looks like, what is possible, and how we're going to get there. And so, given that, I think those are some of the most. I mean, one of the critiques of Christian nationalism that we published in American Reformer was a critique that was specifically grounded in prudence and the popularity and viability of these ideas in a society that really is not certainly anywhere close to majority support for many of the core tenets of Christian nationalism. So, given that, what's going to be a winning electoral agenda next year? What's going to be a vision that we can put forward that actually inspires people? And really, like, is this a society? Is American culture itself likely to embrace this, or does that require something that's actually too much of a turn from? I think really recall the sort of nationalism, something that's actually some of the fundamental characteristics of our nation. Those are good debates. With you, I'm sympathetic to the Christian nationalism vision. What I would say I really sort of come down as I'm pro Christendom. Whether that's in the form of something that, whether that's with a label like Christian nationalism, whether it's in the form of some of the Christian nationalism agendas, I can very, very confidently say I'm pro Christendom. We need to reshape society and institutions in a way that accords with Christian vision, Christian morals, and I'm certainly sympathetic toward a lot of the views raised of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like, we have to. I like the analysis that says we have to base our political theory, our political philosophy on something. Like the myth of neutrality being so pervasive, like, oh, we can just allow this marketplace of ideas. Well, the marketplace itself is based on a specific set of ideas, that all ideas are of equal value, and you let them all fight it out, and the best one will win. It's like, well, that is itself is a belief about reality. So, what are we going to actually base our political philosophy on? And if you root it in the gospel and the truth of the Bible and scriptural truth, you start from a much more solid foundation. There's a much more honoring of men and women and families and institutions. It's the proper place to root it. And now, as a label for that, Christian nationalism may or may not be an effective term. I know it's a very divisive one, but I think ultimately the philosophy, the idea behind it, I find compelling. I've been working my way through Stephen Wolfe's book, and I find it to be a very well reasoned, very thoughtful approach to many different aspects of it. And so I appreciate the dialogue for that reason. But yeah, as an ideology, as Christian nationalism is sometimes presented, I'm not in favor of. I don't think that's the right way of going about the question at all.
You mentioned surprising objections to it. I'm interested in what you see as the most I guess, interesting or surprising challenges, and how to engage those.
Yeah, so for me, I saw a lot of these discussions talking about Christianity and masculinity, because to start putting these two pieces together in a feminized church, starting to see the resistance coming from men to a lot of very clear, obvious biblical truths, whether they be pastors or parishioners, that has really surprised me. It shows up very concretely in the notions of physical fitness. Like, hey, let's go to the gym and let's get some activity going. Let's clean up our diet. The resistance that comes from basic, simple ideas like that was a real sign for me, confronting a lot of the way that men have become very effeminate. And so when I started running that out to men gathering in churches, to concepts embodied in the book like Masculine Christianity by Zach Garris, male headship, submission, etc., naturally, as you start running that out to a political landscape, there are a lot of men who are not comfortable with masculinity, I think, at a very deep level, who are going to resist a Christian dominion spread out from beyond that. So for me, looking at places like, I guess, the Gospel Coalition is the first one that comes to mind. That was, of course, not totally surprising, because coming from a perspective where I view the world through a masculine Christian lens, let's say, maybe to give myself too much credit, but let's just call it that. It wasn't a surprise for me to like, whoa, let's slow down on this Christian nationalism thing. But I think one that also really surprised me was Sovereign Nations and James Lindsay, because he does a lot of really great work on really piecing apart liberalism and Marxism and occultism and how these things wind together. So seeing him take such a strong stance against Christian nationalism and seeing men rally around him, that has really surprised me. So I think some of it's a surprise, some of it's less of a surprise, but it's a necessary sifting.
So I'll push a little bit on that last one, actually, because you mentioned one word that you used there when you described Lindsay, pushing back against liberalism. And I would say Lindsay has pushed back against leftism. But
Yeah.
Lindsay is fundamentally a liberal.
Yes, I agree.
And I think that's become clear in many of these debates. When it comes down to it, there's not even a question of there's not even a lot of clarity on what he would return to. I mean, I don't think Lindsay would reverse gay marriage. Not at all clear he would reverse gay marriage. Well, that was 2015. So we're talking, what is the ideal? It's sort of liberalism up through gay marriage, but then we just end the trans and the queer. Good luck with that. I don't think that's much of a coherent alternative vision. So a lot of those people, I think, it sort of became clear in the course of these debates that they actually had a profoundly different vision for society. They were on the same side. And they were making often very useful arguments, fighting against the sort of radical extremes of the woke left in the last half of the last decade, and then certainly the early COVID years. But they liked the liberalism of. Certainly, they like the liberalism of the 90s, of the 80s and the 90s, and that's much of the conservative movement. And so I think, and yet that's a one thing that just took a couple decades to produce what we have now. So I don't think that there's a counterfactual where that becomes a sort of great trajectory that's going to preserve the things that we value without the problems, but they don't have a clear alternative they can offer. And when it comes down to it, they sharply oppose Christian norms in the public square. You talked about that question earlier. Based on what? They would base it on a set of liberal axioms. We would, whatever vision I want, it will be based on Christ. It'll be based on a Christian understanding of the world, grounded and reflected in Genesis 1. That's why understanding Genesis 1 is so important, right? A lot of the opposition is effectively a sort of Gnostic Christianity. It's a Christianity that it's really stripped of that understanding of the created order as something that's actually good. God created it and it was good. When you understand that, you understand that not just you have sort of a heavenly mission in your life, but you also have an earthly good that you're called to, a vision of what life should look like. And a lot of them reject that and lack that. And
this shows up. That's great, because this just shows up in the relationship that many Christian men have to their masculinity.
Yes.
Right? Like it is made fundamentally good. Are you, as a man, obviously not in a salvific sense, but you made as a man and a woman made as a woman, is that fundamentally good? Is the created order good? And a lot of men just can't get there because feminism has worked its way so deep into their psyche that they can't actually accept that being a man is a good thing. That's why Michael Foster's book, It's Good to Be a Man, what a controversial title, that men need to even be told that.
Yep. And what's interesting, and I guess going to sort of surprising pushbacks on things, here's what I'll say is interesting, and maybe not surprising, but it's interesting, is you'll see opposition, and it's really opposition to the new right in defense of the liberal order. You'll see that from a very wide range of Christian traditions. It's kind of like John Piper can get there from a sort of Baptist tradition. That's not that surprising. In many ways, sort of the Baptists have a long, it's not a, I wouldn't say that's a sharp departure from his tradition. That's in line with a Baptist tradition. But then you have two kingdoms people sort of morph into radical two kingdoms. And radical two kingdom theology somehow very conveniently almost sacralizes an American liberal order. Yeah, you have theonomists get there, and the theonomists get, I mean, theoretically, those people would be radically different, right? Van Drunen and Sandlin should be coming at things from very different perspectives. But no, they somehow arrive at their various traditions at almost the exact same political opinion. And it's not that surprising, actually, because smart people can get to where they want to get. And if what they want to get is they want to get to a version of their theological tradition that doesn't conflict with the world, that doesn't require a sharp challenge to the liberal order. Again, you can get there from Kuyperianism, neo-Kuyperianism. Keller is interested in engaging every square inch. I think he actually recovered a lot of things that are valuable about that sort of more robust Protestant tradition, but he treated it as a little more of an engagement question than Kuyper talked about the war between Christianity and modernism. So you just tweak a few things about Kuyper and you get to something that allows you to sort of comfortably engage it. It's kind of like all of these traditions end up getting to more or less the same place, and in a place that would have been sort of most understandable to Anabaptists who sort of from their very roots avoided conflict. Well, their very early roots actually had some pretty sharp conflicts, but shortly thereafter, for centuries and centuries, they would find a way to sort of make peace with whatever regime. So it's not surprising, but I think it's indicative of a motivated desire on many people to reconcile their theological tradition with 20th century liberalism.
Yeah, that's the conclusion that I find very difficult to avoid. That there is some to say what degree it's self-serving is difficult, but there is some desires like, well, maybe we can reconcile it this way out of some positive idea to make peace with an unfriendly world. Like that's the best possible case. So let me kick an idea out here and see what we can do with this. What if the difference, and I don't know that I agree with this, but I just want to kick it out there and we'll see what happens. So what if the difference is that Christian nationalism is this giant top-down vision for fitting, the way that it's presented is this giant top-down vision for fitting everything into a sensible system, right? Of making Christianity in the world fit in this holistic vision. And for some people, this top-down approach is too much versus aggressive approach on the ground from the bottom up. Could that be the nature of some of the conflict, that some people just look at Christian nationalism as a comprehensive vision, like, wow, that's way too much for me to take in. But if you set me to work in my department, maybe I can take that in. Could that be the root of some of the conflict?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the questions are prudential questions. What's the best way to accomplish directionally what we want to accomplish? And I think there's a natural conservative aversion to any sort of comprehensive, anything that sort of seems potentially ideological. And absolutely, I can see how Christian nationalism can fit that. So, and what I would say is, I don't think that Christian nationalism needs to be treated as a top-down prescriptive vision for society to be useful. I think in many ways, I mean, a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs enjoy reading science fiction. Why do they enjoy reading science fiction? Not because they're using it as a prescription for exactly what they build, but just because I think people who are trying to innovate and create benefit from more concrete pictures that can inspire where they're going, even if they're taking small steps. So I think there's a way in which you could think of a lot of the discussion around Christian nationalism. Certainly, you think of the aspects, some of the more controversial things that Stephen Wolfe has written, talking about the sort of ideal of a Christian prince, or what a sort of thoroughly Christian, a society that sort of whose laws are thoroughly Christian could look like for a Christian people. That's not something that you're going. I mean, those aren't things that are going to factor into either what you do in business or in politics or in your church in the next year, most likely. But it's helpful it can be helpful just envisioning expanding your mental model with a vision of something that's different from liberal norms, because many people can't conceive out of those. So I think you're right that there's a lot of valid pushback to anything that's too prescriptive. And I actually think one of the most thoughtful reviews of Wolf's book, I think, was, and I'm the name is escaping me at the moment, but it touched on some of that. It touched on a sort of perhaps a vision of the state that would be a little more substantive than something that would reflect the American tradition. I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I think it's interesting. Nonetheless, even if you're not using it as a prescription, it's inspiring to have a model. It allows you to consider proposals, including proposals that may be much more politically realistic, but potentially offensive to conservatives anchored only to the past, to preserving the sort of status quo. You can at least consider something that may be politically popular, but is outside of the norm, the 20th century Overton window, and recognize that it actually makes sense in a different vision.
I really like that, because I think the conflict over Stephen Wolf's book and Christian nationalism has been, I mean, I guess under the conflict point between liberalism, an affirmative vision of liberalism and Christianity and all the different cultural things that are all mixed up. But I think you raise a really important point, which is that at least someone's putting forth a vision of something, right? The big weakness of liberalism, and I discovered this during my time in San Francisco, is they won't actually put forth the vision that they really want. They won't ever actually say it, right? To drag a liberal into the light and say, actually paint the picture of the society that you want to live in. Like the World Economic Forum, you will own nothing and be happy. Like how quickly they backtracked on that. And they say, oh no, that's a conspiracy theory. It's like, we have the photo from your website, right? No one actually wants to hear that. So there's this gap that's left. It's like someone to please put forth an affirmative vision. And so at least the Christian nationalists, particularly Wolf and his thoroughness, stepped forward into that gap and said, here is an affirmative vision. You don't have to like it. I'm not going to force this on you, but at least someone was painting a picture of a society that we can begin reclaiming real American values in. And I don't think that should be overlooked, that there are people out there putting forth an affirmative vision. Yes, of course, it's fair to critique it. Yes, of course, it's fair to not like aspects of it or even to take theological issue with some of it. But at least we can celebrate someone is painting a picture that we can begin refining to move it towards something that we can begin implementing. I think that's a really vital process.
Exactly. That is what inspires people. And I'll actually use a much more common analog to that is Trump's agenda. He moved from a party that was all about sort of procedural issues, market mechanisms without a substantive vision to make America great again. That's a positive vision that a wide range of people can rally around and inspire them. And it's not as comprehensive. There's a lot to flesh out in what does a great America look like, but it is a call to action to something that's positive.
You know what's really interesting about that is that the Make America Great Again and Christian nationalism were attacked for the same reasons, that they're primarily a quote unquote like a white agenda, right? That was my overarching impression of the way that people came at Make America Great Again, is that it's a white thing. Same with Christian nationalism. I think that's a fascinating parallel.
It's interesting, and it's interesting that they say it's a white thing, and they often assume that alone is a sufficient critique. I mean, first off, yeah. I don't even know if it's true. I mean, certainly Trump won more. He won more Hispanics, for instance. Now, many of them may increasingly see themselves as white and want to be integrated into that society. But second of all, is that a bad thing? It's a white thing that's supposed to be a bad thing? I mean, that's just sort of assumed and taken for granted. And it's not a real critique. It's a critique that's grounded. And that's why they're so afraid of breaking out. That's a critique that assumes the modern woke liberal framing. Whereas if it's primarily white, it must be bad. Mm-hmm. They're not defending that proposition. If anything, taking that logic too far, would go in some directions that would be, I think, very, very uncomfortable for them. And they have a very, very racialized way of looking at the world that is, again, exactly like your point that they don't want to explain the vision of the world. They really, they have a truly revolutionary way of looking at the world in a way that is going to, I think, disturb a lot of people when they see its full implications. So they stick to buzzwords and try to sort of assume that latching on to white guilt that they've been conditioned to hold based on aspects of our nation's history will be enough to make that a sufficient critique.
Yeah, whether the white angle has any substance behind it, it's certainly enough to make people scatter. It's a politically effective tool.
It has been, certainly. I think that one of the most important things the right can do is totally neuter those lines of attack, because the left essentially has relied, and you saw this during Trump, right? You saw this during the Trump era. They rely on their ability to label something as beyond the pale, as some sort of ism or phobia, as an absolute trump card. And that's especially with race being the ultimate one, as the trump card, grounded in a mix of sort of Americans' guilt and a almost sort of axiomatic adherence to certain liberal principles. And that ultimately is what can banish any non-liberal value system. And you see that same card being employed by people like James Lindsay in a lot of their critiques, is they really, their arguments very, very closely parallel the arguments that wokes would be making against these ideologies. And the problem for them is the necessity for our movement is learning to reject that card as a trump card and just force them to take their argument further, force them to take their critique further, and get into the substance. And I think Trump was one of the first politicians who was not afraid of that card. He would just take them head on. And as a movement, we need to become conditioned to ignore that card and get to what is the substantive critique you have.
Is it? I agree with you. Is it to ignore the card? Because that might be the answer. But the question I have in response is like, so, as Christians, we're called to always be able to give a reasoned defense of the hope that is within us, right? Like apologetics. So is it necessary? And what's funny is I have this thought running in the back of my head, like at the risk of being canceled, let me ask this question. And I think that's symptomatic of the whole problem. Is it necessary to develop a quote unquote white apologetics? Like that whole, I cringe at the thought of that, but it's like, is it just to ignore the question because I know this comes up over and over again. It's like, so we just have to pretend that it's not a thing. I don't have an answer to any of this, but it seems to me that there could be a case to say that like, there's a place for whatever we consider white to be. Let's just assert that it's a thing, in a way that so that we don't have to define the boundaries of it at the moment. But like, would it be necessary to rather than just ignore it, to say like, well, hold on, let's actually talk about contributions. Like, is it necessary for individuals to begin developing that in the same way that we develop an individual Christian apologetic?
It's a complicated question. It's not one that I will claim any particular expertise on.
Sure.
I will say, I think, in response to your point that we need a reason for what we believe, I'll point to Jesus's example and say Jesus routinely refused to engage bad faith critics on their terms. So I don't think that we have any obligation to answer the attacks of a bad faith critic. We can choose to, but in that case, you're not engaging them. In that case, your audience is the crowd in most cases. Your audience is trying to persuade people. I mean, Jesus routinely would engage them when they forced him to engage them, but he refused to engage them on their terms and would parry their attack and turn the conversation in a way that would leave them looking foolish. So I think that I think what you talk about is certainly can be a potential rhetorical move. And there's a lot of different potential rhetorical moves. I don't think the right is well developed. The right has spent decades being catechized on how to logically be right. You have numerous numerous influencers, numerous platforms. They're going to teach you why the conservative answer is the economically efficient one. That's not how you win these arguments. We need to learn rhetoric. And I think you can learn rhetoric from, there's no one better to learn rhetoric from than Jesus, who was a master, absolute master of dealing with rhetorical attacks by bad faith opponents. So, but it needs to be applied in our modern situation. It needs to be applied to any number of political problems. So first off, we don't owe them anything, but sometimes it can be prudent to respond. Sometimes it isn't. In terms of the apologetic, I guess my inclination is not to focus on racialized terms necessarily, but to focus on our tradition very strongly. I mean, certainly the Anglo-American tradition, which is certainly a subset of that, has deeply shaped how we think about a lot of things. And I'll be very comfortable. There's things there that might not be universal to plenty of other ethnic groups, but they are or they're ways of thinking, modes of thinking about these things. I think certainly we need to be very comfortable accepting the goodness of the tradition we come from. This is a tradition that produced many great things. It produced the American system. It produced, in many ways, I could say, liberalism. And I'm not an opponent of classical liberalism. I think classical liberalism is a very good thing in many ways. I would reframe it. Classical liberalism is not the sort of dogmatic, absolute set of rules that we have to observe and everything else flows from it. Classical liberalism, in many ways, is a good of the Anglo-American tradition. The Anglo-American tradition has developed cultural traits. It's developed practices. It's developed norms and values that allow classical liberal solutions. In many ways, you can think of the classical liberal solutions as very good, right? I mean, things like trial by jury is a mechanism that protects against conviction of the innocent. It only works in a society where you have a norm where that jury of peers is very, very widely going to be committed to the truth. If you start to see the sort of biases toward a racial group, toward a family group, toward any other number of groups that are pervasive almost everywhere else in the world, the jury system is just not going to work. It's going to hang more often. It's going to come to a verdict that's correlated not with guilt or innocence, but just with who happened to be on the jury. But it's a good thing to be able to have a jury, but it only works in a society that has a set of norms. So I think we can recognize and celebrate the good of those norms. And we can recognize that, and I think make the argument to those who do like classical liberalism, who value it, who value free markets, that only a society that is deeply shaped by and anchored to these norms and to this culture is going to be able to preserve these good things, and in some cases is going to be able to preserve these good things.
Yeah, I like the responses that you're talking about. That first of all, to de-racialize the conversation. I think that's really important, especially because race is not a biblical category, like ethnicity is. And I think that once you begin taking that approach, you can look at the different traditions, as you say, that begin producing different things and evaluate them based on their conformity to truth, based on their conformity to higher principles, beauty, justice, etc. And then that can lead to a place where we can have an actual productive conversation about the contributions of different people to a fabric of a society. But immediately racializing it and making things in terms of black, white, brown, whatever, yeah, I don't think that's going to be a productive. I don't think it's going to be a productive approach. So I appreciate that clarification. I also like what you had to say about the way that Jesus didn't reply to bad faith commenters, bad faith. He just ignored them or turned them around in a way that would humiliate the questioner. I appreciate that approach as well, and I think that's probably ultimately a more powerful strategy.
It really is something that I think our movement needs to learn because we've been so unconditioned in the other way, and the left is very good at that. In many ways, the left won the moral argument in 2022 over abortion. That was a sort of widespread assessment among, and I don't mean that in the Supreme Court case, but I mean in the election narrative, in the election rhetoric. They were widely seen as having the moral upper hand, and that contributed to their outperformance in the election. And that is absurd. That should not be the case. But the right doesn't know how to argue morally. In many cases, I think the right is afraid to argue morally. It's a form of cowardice. It's a form of cowardice to always retreat to say, if we accept your framing of this issue. I mean, the most obvious one is on race. To argue for the good of free market solutions, you'll say, okay, the goal here is what's good for Black people. So here's why free markets are actually better for Black people. Please vote for us. Never works. You've already conceded the moral frame that is fits into their sort of racialized set of ideals and goals, and that's ultimately what you're told you must be fighting for. And it's a rhetorically foolish strategy, and it's a cowardly strategy. It's a cowardly strategy because you retreat from confronting the fundamental moral questions to technocratic questions of means.
Mm-hmm. And it's an equity conversation as well. Like how are we biasing or debiasing various groups, right? That's the whole woke agenda, right? That's the not evaluating the individual, and does the individual have access? It's evaluating the group. So it's conceding the liberal frame, or the leftist frame, I should say, right out of the gate.
I'll give I think a great example of this is equality of opportunity. The right loves to talk about equality of opportunity. Sure. They say, well, the left values equality. Equality is dogmatically, we have to believe this in a liberal society, the equality is good. But rather than equality of outcome, we want equality of opportunity. Well, equality of opportunity absolutely and invariably leads to totalitarianism. Because guess what? You raise your kids well, and if you raise your kids well in a good, healthy family, and someone else doesn't, they don't have equal. Those kids don't have equal opportunity. You've given your kids a better opportunity, okay. And if you've elevated as an ideal this idea that not that you should try to elevate opportunity for people, not that you should try to figure out ways to help the opportunity of people who face challenges, but that equality of opportunity is a good thing. The only way they're going to equalize that opportunity is by stripping your kids of some of the advantages they get. And ultimately, that's as totalitarian of an outcome, as definite of a path to wokeism as many of the left's policies are. And that's why I think you've seen many free market-oriented libertarians, a lot of people in the sort of Cato and Cato-adjacent circles, have effectively become woke, because fundamentally they bought into a technocratic equality of opportunity idea that was very economic in the way it looked at the world and thoroughly detached from humanity. And it's very easy to strive for the economic sort of, you could almost say sort of an aesthetic appeal of equality of opportunity as an ideal for them.
So the leftist talking point is equality of outcome, whether stated or not. And typically the right responds by saying equality of opportunity is the right, but equality of opportunity essentially leads to the same same result. Okay, yeah, by additional political steps.
And I would say the non-cowardly thing to do is to reject equality as a goal altogether. Equality is unnatural. Leveling is the fundamental impulse of the left, and its goal ultimately is to destroy all distinctions, including the distinction between man and God.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So okay. So if the which I agree with you, if the non-cowardly thing to do is to demolish the notion of equality as itself a goal, what's the political strategy to talk about that in a place like America, where equality is perhaps held up as the highest national ideal?
Well, so there are aspects of equality that are fine, and one thing is in politics, equal justice under the law is a very particular type of equality that is actually fundamental to our tradition. It's fundamental to our legal tradition, and so I think we don't have to fully reject every aspect of this. Sometimes it's a question of prudence. Which aspects do you talk about in a particular case? But I think that again, a lot of it is rhetorical questions that I will not, again, I won't claim any sort of absolute expertise on,
Sure.
but uh, talk about goods rather than talking about abstract principles. What is equality? Equality is a principle. Equality is not going to make your life any better. If anything, equality satisfies some issues of envy, perhaps, but equality is not the same thing as a material good that you can actually enjoy. So I think what people actually care about, envy aside, is actually basic needs, basic goods, good things they can enjoy. And so, can we talk about goods that we should aspire to, rather than principles that we should focus on? And I think that was the bulk of Trump's appeals. Trump wasn't talking about principles; he was talking very specifically about things he was going to do to make your life better. And that's actually, I think, the essence of successful politics in many cases. I think the other thing is focus on our own moral questions. Hammer them the way they try to hammer us morally, and point out the evils that they embrace. I mean, they're evils, and the evils, some of which will be perpetrated in the name of equality, are just, they're gross evils that are wildly unpopular in America. So we don't need to get to the theoretical side to point out the consequences of their ideology, and we don't need to get to the theoretical side to point out to focus the conversation on the good things that a practical political agenda can offer.
So I want to see if we can feed all this back into technology, because you said that a lot of these evils are wildly unpopular in America, and I agree with you. And yet there's also a component of where these ideas, for as unpopular as they are, they're hugely amplified. And not only are they hugely amplified, the technologically enabled consequences for questioning these ideas are severe. Debanking, deplatforming, etc. So maybe this would be a good time to start fitting back some of the technological visions into how we can begin pushing back on the cultural conversation relative to larger political discussion.
Very big question, and
a little one, no big deal.
Yeah, it's also a very complex one. I think it's hard to. The nature of technological change is complex in ways that make it hard to know the implications of a particular change. I mean, you talk about the number of characters in a tweet, and what are the implications of that? I don't really know. I mean, what types of ideas does that elevate versus others? You can guess at that, but you can't really know. So I think my instinct is there's certainly technology that you can build that has a definite political vision. You can build technology with the explicit purpose of equality. I mean, there's a lot of this. There's a lot of technology that's actually explicit. I mean, you think of a lot of the progressive agenda, the technocratic way of operating, and the entire sort of purpose and strategy is depersonalization, because you recognize that personalization leads to biases, it leads to attachments, it leads to economically irrational decisions. I mean, you think about this: why is it natural for large multinational companies to pay for their employees to go get abortions? Well, they manage people as cells on a spreadsheet, and someone's going to be a much more predictable cell, responding much more predictably to incentives if she doesn't have a baby than if she has a baby. They're going to respond more predictably to incentives if wokeness has helped strip them of any attachments to their culture or their family, and they're now they're now an individual who owns nothing. That person is going to respond much more predictably. So this entire technocratic way of looking at the world is conducive to this sort of liberalism that strips people of attachment, strips people of duties. I would say equality, and I would say duties is the other of any unchosen duties. What's the opposite? Well, don't build technology designed to depersonalize. Build technology that's designed to amplify and facilitate natural human activities. And I think a very, very obvious case is a lot of technology intentionally strips out every aspect of the human when it's facilitating a match. It might not be a picture of the person. There's no information about the person. It's reduced to scores or whatever. That's certainly conducive to a technocratic way of operating. What about technology that actually facilitates connections within your local community more and makes it easier for you to? And this is sort of a central focus that we think about. What about technology that makes it easier for you to do business with people within your community and among a sort of concentric circle of aligned communities with your church and with churches that are similar to your church, either geographically nearby or values aligned or both? I mean, what you're doing is you're taking a natural human instinct, which is you want to do business within true communities where you have a degree of trust and you have a degree of personal interaction, much of which has been crowded out by distant, anonymized digital platforms. And it's been crowded out partially because all of the attention goes to those distant, anonymized platforms. And you're instead directing entrepreneurial energy to how can we actually leverage technology to facilitate something that's going to be more natural and more human. A lot of times it's a very mundane piece of technology. You're not trying to, in a sort of transhuman way, reshape the interaction and come up with some sort of revolutionary new interaction given technology. You're just trying to help facilitate the organization or maybe the scale of how you can do something that is that is very human.
So I think we talked earlier on about technology, artificial intelligence running humans. What about humans running the technology? And so I guess there's a parallel in here to where when you're talking about matching people, if you just leave it to the algorithm without human supervision, you end up in this kind of depersonalization, right? Versus if you have a human involved, you have human biases. And so if you put this natural presence of human biases, this messiness of human biases, together with like maybe some of the ambiguity involved with removing equality as the highest goal, right? And saying that instead, what about goods, where some amount of inequality will be built into the system? Is there a case to be made here for people needing to get much more comfortable with ambiguity in a world where they're trying to strip away all the ambiguity? Because I see a lot of the centralization that's happening in technology, governments, politics, transhumanism as trying to strip out ambiguity and make everything clean and flat and level and nice, which C.S. Lewis kind of talks about in that Hideous Strength. I didn't even mean the pun of nice, but perfect. So is there a case to be made for that?
Absolutely. I mean, what they're stripping out is they're stripping out the human.
Yeah,
and they're replacing with the technological. And in many cases, bureaucracy is an imperfect version of that. Once you have AI, you can thoroughly eliminate the human. But judgment is one of the most fundamental aspects of one of the most fundamental things you do as a human is make judgments. Mm-hmm. Those judgments are going to contain potentially they're going to contain flawed decision making. They're going to contain flawed biases. But they're also going to contain the entrepreneurial bets that you make. So if you're an investor and you're deciding who to back, you're judging. Your entire job is to judge between different potential outlets for your money, and you could either do so in a way that is increasingly depersonalized. But what is that going to converge toward? That's going to converge toward bonds or apartment buildings, like something that you can sort of pencil out perfectly on a spreadsheet and there's almost no risk or question there. That is going to strip out any sort of bet on an idea or bet on a person that can't be thoroughly explained on the spreadsheet. So what makes venture itself, what makes the sort of entrepreneurial bet, what makes you take a risk on a young person? Let's say it is real estate, but let's say it's a young person who's just getting started in the real estate business and he comes to you with an idea, flipping a house. And it's risky. The guy doesn't have a full track record. There's a lot of judgments about the neighborhood. You make a bet to take a risk on that person. You know his character. You know his judgment. That's a judgment. And that's a judgment that, from an outsider, from a technocratic perspective, is indistinguishable from the sort of bias that they would try to strip away. And you can't get rid of the possibility of one without the other. So yes, we should 100% get comfortable with the fact that the vitality in our economy, the entrepreneurial judgment that produces excess returns comes from human judgment and discrimination.
So I guess then the question becomes, the push for artificial intelligence that I've watched from my time in the tech world in San Francisco way back when always seemed to have this idea that everything human could be represented with an equation. That all the human could be boiled down. It's fundamentally materialistic in the most gross sort of way, and I've never liked it. I obviously never agreed with it. But there's a component here of like, maybe we can't represent everything about what it means to be human with an equation. Maybe it's not all math. Maybe it's not all, electrical signals in the brain and atoms bumping into each other. Maybe there's more to us than just numbers.
Not only is that true, I think that presents one of our greatest opportunities and advantages in technology. So another way that we can win, the question I wake up every day and ask is, how can we win? Because ultimately, if we're not trying for something at that scale, I don't think we're ambitious enough. They are on a highly destructive path with society. There are many, many ways for us to gain the upper hand. So what you described points to one. I think they have a powerful blind spot about human nature and about technology, and it's going to lead them to make major mistakes. We don't just have a different set of values. So often I think conservative investing is boiled down to values. We have a values filter. We don't like to invest in companies that do abortion. We view the world fundamentally. It's the assumption is we view the world very similarly. We just like different things than they do. I don't think that's right. I think they have fundamentally flawed views of the world. And if we believe we're right and they're wrong, there should be profoundly important implications of that when it comes to investment and entrepreneurial decisions. And one of those is how you bet on technology with respect to people. So they have a view that is a highly optimistic view that AI can replace many, many aspects of people. I believe I have a more pessimistic view of AI. I also have a far more optimistic view of people than they do. And I don't believe it can. And I'm willing to bet that in many, many categories, the category winner is going to be a tool that complements people rather than replaces people. And to give an example of this, and it's not even going to AI, it's even simpler. Mm-hmm. For 50 years, Silicon Valley and economists, again, common foe in the space, for 50 years, Silicon Valley and economists have had this idea that we should be able to replace brokers. We should be able to engineer away their functions, that they're nothing but a transaction cost that's an inefficiency in the system. And they've tried and failed many times to replace brokers. And what they've failed to do is they've failed to understand the sort of profoundly important role that brokers play in mediating trust in deeply complex systems. And there's a whole range of functions like tacit knowledge, trust, just all sorts of things that are way more complicated than they imagine that some sort of fairly simple pricing algorithm or whatever can achieve. And I think it's a reflection of the technocratic mindset failing to appreciate the complexity of human society and really how entrepreneurial finance is actually value creating in important ways. And if they failed at that, that's an opportunity to take the other side of that trade. You're certainly going to avoid mistakes that they're going to make. But in many cases, technology is going to change the sector. And the only question is, what piece of technology is going to be the winner? And if they have a pessimistic view of people, they'll likely bet on the one that replaces people wholesale. If we have a more optimistic view of the people, we may well bet on the one that empowers those people to do their work more productively. And winning a category like that could be $1 trillion business. That could be, in some cases, those could be major disruptive category winners that shape the nature of the digital age. So how do we win? We win by recognizing and exploiting their blind spots. And I think disruptive technology is one of the best places to do that.
Do you ever feel like you're reclaiming some of the early pioneering spirit of the digital entrepreneurial age, like Hewlett Packard and Apple in their very early days, that were very committed to they believed in people. They created initially human empowering technologies by humans who created the technologies rather than this purely technocratic, bureaucracies that they've become.
Absolutely. I think early Silicon Valley was in many ways a sort of pinnacle of the American spirit, of the combination of pioneering with tinkering. And in many ways, I think American business and American entrepreneurship has been a triumph of practical entrepreneurs, people who figure out how to make things that work and build things. It's not rooted in abstract theory. And Silicon Valley embodied that combination. Now, I would say that early Silicon Valley was largely without God, and that set the stage. They had a view of the person. There was a high view of the person that was grounded in the Christian vision of society, the Protestant culture that had built our country, but had lost it at that point. So it was not consciously using that technology to glorify God. It was more likely technology for the advance of technology's sake, which I think is something that we saw in the middle of the century. They accomplished great things because they did have, in many ways, a correct view of the person and a correct view of. There were many great things about it, but it led to a sort of natural trajectory that tended to become an entirely technical way of viewing the world and technocratic way of viewing the world that merges with a broader progressivism, which is actually self-defeating for that, because the progressivism, in turn, strips out the humanity from society. And stripping out the humanity is going to destroy the conditions that allow for that entrepreneurial innovation. So I think we need to recover that. We need to rediscover that. We need to really remobilize people who many Americans still are drawn to that system and still hold those values. But we need to do so in a way that is thoroughly anchored to a positive Christian vision that's going to maintain the foundation for that type of innovation.
Now that is an exciting vision, to imagine the early days of Silicon Valley paired with the Christian ethic, with the Christian worldview. That is exciting.
Absolutely. And that I think motivates people in a way that I see every day when I talk to people who are recognizing something that we haven't seen. They haven't seen up to this point, and it's really something new. It's new in our lifetimes. It's new in generations.
Just one more. I know we've just got a couple minutes left, but I wonder if you could share some of the feedback you've gotten from people, some of the things that excite you about it, that you've witnessed as you're putting this vision forth.
So it's a lot. I think that you find people excited by purpose. And to give a story of one guy on our team had done, he'd spent 10 years on Wall Street. He did fine on Wall Street. He bought a company, grew the company, sold the company. Relatively young guy, is financially independent, and was connected by a mutual friend who knew what we were doing, and fundamentally was just looking for an opportunity to put his talents to work building the country that he wanted to live in. It wasn't even something that he was necessarily consciously doing. He was thinking about nonprofit opportunities and various things, but kind of knew that that's not playing to his strength. And I think it was incredibly energizing to see that he doesn't need to abandon business. In fact, business can be a powerful lever for him to change the country in a way that is really at the forefront of what needs to happen here. Joined the company, has jumped into a number of things, created tremendous value, and brought a set of skills that are badly needed to our movement if we're going to especially play a role where we can be mediating capital, be mediating talent, be helping broker deals, and really help provide the sort of connections that are a multiplier for our movement. We see entrepreneurs. I think we see entrepreneurs who probably would not start a company if it weren't for knowing that there's an emerging venture ecosystem ready to back them. They know they know what they want to do, but they know that it's sort of thoroughly political enough that it's not going to fit into it's not going to fit into an ecosystem that is left dominated or apolitical. And so the presence of a firm like ours, it gives them the confidence that there's a ecosystem growing that's going to support them as a growing company needs. We talk to people all the time who are looking for, and again, we're early, and I'm not able to provide the opportunities I want to provide to so many people. But they went from values alignment being a nice to have to something where they are actively putting their time and their effort into planning. Okay, what can I do over the next 1 year, 2 year, 5 years that can get me to the point where I can be part of this movement, where this is what I know that I really want to do. Is what I'm going to feel fulfilled about. And then I think finally there's just, on the American Reformer side, the excitement around these trends in Christianity, the excitement around these new ideas, the excitement around being around other Christians who have really a more inspiring vision, I think it's evident as you see these online discussions, as you see the in person with our Cat and Mather fellows. It was energizing to be around this group of rising leaders, pastors, intellectuals who are excited by the ability to take on the hardest questions of our day, who know that they have answers that are attractive and compelling, both to what the left says and to what other sides of the right say. And so I think there's an excitement and an optimism around the fact that we actually have something that's attractive to people. We have something that is beginning to address many of these gnawing problems that have left conservatives uncomfortable for decades. Essentially, they've been unanswered problems that lead to a prevailing pessimism. And we know we have answers to those. We know we have answers that not everything is laid out, not everything's answered, but we have compelling solutions that attract people, and we have ideas and paths to get there.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. And so thank you for all of that. And that's incredibly exciting to me. And I can understand why you've generated such excitement around these ideas and the many projects that you're working on. So just, for the men listening, how can they participate and support what you're doing?
So there's a lot of ways that we're trying to open up opportunities for different people. First, following us. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm most active on Twitter at Nate A. Fischer. Talk about a range of different things there. You can check out the websites, newfounding.com, americanreformer.org. American Reformer has the articles and has some of the other projects. New Founding, there's a lot of different ways. We launched our fund, as I said, and it's an angel-less rolling fund. That's open to accredited investors. That's sort of an easy way to get involved, where we're mediating. We have a deal room, and we have ways that if you're building something, you can submit it to us. We'd love to hear from entrepreneurs. We'd love to hear about people doing exciting projects, especially that fit the sort of angel and seed phase that we're really focused on at this point. And then we have a talent network, and we have a few different networks. But if you're looking for a job, we have some really attractive opportunities in the talent network for people who are with aligned companies. Some are with companies where they're going to be values aligned in culture. What they're doing is some sort of general business. Some of them are companies that are actively in the movement, actually, in a sense, self-consciously political, or doing something that has sort of a clear purpose, directly tied to our mission, which is the sort of company that we invest in. And there's job opportunities there. So you can join our talent network. You can look at the opportunities there. Professional firms, we have a way to get involved there. And so there's a number of different. Ultimately, our goal is how can we offer the outlet to help you put your energy toward building this future, and kind of wherever you're coming from. We're looking to do that. At the very least, follow us, and we'll be adding things over time.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to refer as many people as I can too, because I think that there are a lot of men and women who are going to want to participate in everything that you're talking about.
I appreciate that, and I've enjoyed this.
Me as well. Thank you so much for your time today, Nate.
Thank you for yours.